The envelope slid through the mail slot and stopped against my shoe. Thick, official, addressed to me in a font I didn't recognize. Inside were charges I'd never agreed to. Accounts I didn't remember opening, marked current and active. In the corner, my son's handwriting labeled it neatly. Care plan. The heater clicked on. The phone stayed silent, and the numbers kept adding up. Before I go any further, let me ask you something quietly. Where are you listening from right now? A kitchen, a parked car, a living room that feels a little too still. Stories like this don't arrive loudly. They slip into ordinary moments and sit there, waiting to be noticed. If you feel that, pause with me, stay here. And if this channel feels familiar to you, you're welcome to subscribe. What comes next only matters if you keep listening. After my husband passed, my days settled into a careful rhythm. Mornings began with the kettle and the radio turned low. Afternoons were spent at the dining table, sorting mail on the same oak surface that still carried a faint ring from an old coffee mug. I kept my papers in a blue accordion folder, labeled in my own neat handwriting. Utilities. Insurance. Groceries. It wasn't elegant, but it was mine, and it worked. My son started coming by more often then. He let himself in with the spare key and announced his presence the way he always had, voice steady, shoes set by the door. He noticed small things. A porch light that flickered. A loose hinge on the hallway door. He carried boxes without being asked and tightened knobs with a screwdriver he kept in his truck. When he offered to help organize my paperwork, it felt natural, thoughtful. I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel corrected. One afternoon we sat together at the table while sunlight moved slowly across the floor. He stacked envelopes into neat piles and brought out a slim binder with clear plastic sleeves. "Just to keep everything simple," he said, sliding papers into place. I watched his hands move with confidence. He'd always been like that. As a boy, he lined up his toy cars by size. As a man, he trusted systems. He labeled tabs in black ink. Housing, services, accounts. I noticed he wrote quickly, without hesitation, like he already knew where everything belonged. When I reached for my blue folder, he gently set it aside and said he'd consolidate things so I wouldn't have to juggle two systems. The word consolidate sounded efficient. Responsible. I nodded and let him continue. My routine didn't change much after that. I still cooked the same meals, still watered the fern by the window, still walked to the mailbox late in the afternoon when the street was quiet. But I stopped opening every envelope right away. Some went straight into the binder. Some were already opened, corners smoothed flat, pages stacked neatly. He said it saved me time. I believed him. He set reminders on his phone and left notes on the refrigerator. Electric, handled. Internet, paid. His handwriting appeared more often than mine. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like help. When neighbors asked how I was managing, I told them my son had things under control. The words came easily. I meant them. There were small details I noticed but didn't linger on. A statement tucked behind another. A bill addressed to me with a return logo I didn't recognize. The binder grew thicker. The tabs multiplied. He suggested autopay for a few items so I wouldn't have to worry. I didn't argue. I didn't feel worried. On evenings when the house felt too quiet, he stayed a little longer. We ate soup at the counter. He rinsed his bowl and set it in the rack, always facing the same direction. He reminded me to lock the door at night and replaced a bulb over the sink. When he left, he carried the binder with him, saying he'd bring it back updated. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The radio hummed. The kettle steamed. My blue folder sat where I'd left it, untouched. I stood at the dining table, smoothing the wood with my palm, and waited for the mail to arrive. The first call came while I was rinsing a plate at the sink. The phone vibrated against the counter, a low, impatient sound. I dried my hands and answered without looking at the screen. The woman on the line spoke quickly, reading from something prepared. She asked me to confirm my address and date of birth. I told her she must have the wrong number. She paused, then repeated my information back to me, word for word. She said the account was past due and asked when I planned to make a payment. I told her I didn't have an account with her company. There was another pause. Keys tapped. Then she said, calmly, that the account had been opened online 3 months earlier, authorized in my name. She offered to email the contract. I said no and ended the call. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching water run over the plate until it turned cold. Later that afternoon, I took the binder from the shelf where my son had placed it during his last visit. It felt heavier than I remembered. I set it on the dining table and opened it carefully, as if it might resist. Inside were sections I hadn't seen before: services, equipment, coverage. Each sleeve held neatly aligned pages. I pulled out the first document. My name was printed at the top, my address beneath it. At the bottom was a signature, my name again, written in a clean digital script that wasn't mine. The date matched the week my son had reorganized the paperwork. I turned the page. Then another. Internet upgrades, monitoring services, maintenance plans for appliances I didn't own. Each page listed a monthly charge, modest on its own, easy to overlook. Together, they formed a steady draw. My phone vibrated. A text from my son. Handled a few updates today. All covered. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, more envelopes arrived. They were addressed to me, but the language felt unfamiliar. Terms I wouldn't choose. Services I wouldn't request. Some said welcome, others said confirmation. When my son stopped by that weekend, he moved through the house as usual, opening a window, checking the back door. He noticed the binder on the table and smiled. "Looks organized, right?" he said. I asked him about one of the accounts. Just one. I named the company and asked why it was under my name. He didn't hesitate. He said it was easier that way. He said vendors needed a primary holder. He said it kept everything centralized. When I asked why I hadn't signed anything, he waved it off and said it was standard authorization, nothing I needed to worry about. I asked him to show me where I'd given permission. He reached for the binder, flipped to a page, and pointed to a paragraph dense with fine print. He read one sentence aloud, skipping the rest. It mentioned consent. He said he'd explained it at the time. I didn't remember that conversation. He closed the binder and stood. "I've got it under control," he said. "You don't need the stress." After he left, I sat back down and opened the binder again. I read the pages slowly, line by line. Some agreements referenced a linked payment method. Others listed automatic withdrawals. I pulled my bank statements and noticed deductions I had dismissed as routine. The amounts were consistent, predictable. Designed not to call attention, I called one company directly and asked for copies of the authorization. They emailed a scanned form. My name was typed, my address correct. The signature block showed a checkbox marked Authorized Representative. Under it was my son's email address. The representative explained the process without emotion. Accounts could be opened by a designated manager. Changes could be made without additional verification. Everything was compliant, she said. Properly documented. That evening, I spread the papers across the dining table until the oak surface disappeared beneath them. I lined them up by date, then by amount. I saw how services overlapped, how one upgrade triggered another, how cancellation windows had already closed. After dinner, the phone rang again. Another company, another confirmation. This time, they mentioned a missed payment and a possible impact on my credit profile. I asked when the account had been opened. They gave me a date. It was the same week my son told me everything was taken care of. The house felt different after that, even though nothing in it had moved. The walls stood where they always had. The clock kept its uneven tick, but something invisible had shifted, and it followed me from room to room like a draft I couldn't seal. I moved more carefully through my days. I stopped humming while I cooked. At the grocery store, I reread labels I already knew by heart. At the checkout, I hesitated before tapping my card, watching the screen longer than necessary, waiting for a mistake to surface. Nothing ever did. Still, my shoulders stayed tight all the way home. I began checking the mail twice a day. Not because I expected new answers, but because I didn't want to be surprised by them. I stacked envelopes into clean piles and opened them with the old letter opener I'd owned for years, its handle smoothed by habit. Even thin envelopes felt heavy in my hands. Some mornings, I sat at the dining table with my tea untouched, staring at the wood grain. In the polish, I could see a faint reflection of myself, softened by age and scratches. I thought about how easily my name had been placed on those pages. How cleanly it appeared, typed, filed, as if my presence had been reduced to a line of text that could be moved wherever it was needed. When my son called, I answered the same way I always had. I listened more than I spoke. He talked about timelines, about tasks he'd handled, about how much simpler things were now that everything was streamlined. His voice was steady, confident. When there was a pause, I filled it with something neutral. A comment about the weather, a question about his work. I didn't mention the nights I slept lightly, waking at every sound. I noticed small changes in how others addressed me. A customer service agent used my first name without asking. Another referred to me as the account holder in a tone that carried distance rather than respect. Once I was asked to confirm my identity by sending a code to an email address I didn't recognize. I corrected it, politely. It felt easier than explaining why it mattered. At the bank, I stood in line and watched the backs of other people's coats. I thought about how many systems were built on assumption. That whoever stood at the counter understood what they were agreeing to. That whoever signed had meant to. When it was my turn, I asked a simple question about my balance. The teller answered without concern. I thanked her and stepped aside, the receipt folded small in my hand. Back home, I tried to return to routine. I watered the fern. I folded laundry slowly, smoothing each piece before stacking it. But even these small tasks felt altered, as if they no longer belonged entirely to me. As if I were borrowing space inside my own life. There were moments when doubt crept in quietly. Maybe this was how things were done now. Maybe I was being overly cautious. Maybe help simply looked different these days. The thought never stayed long. It was always replaced by a dull pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being erased. One evening, I sat in the living room with the lamp turned low and listened to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. The sound was steady, dependable. I thought about how much of my life had been built on being dependable, on paying on time, on keeping records, on not being a problem. Somewhere along the way, that steadiness had been mistaken for permission. I didn't feel angry. I felt smaller, not in body, but in presence. Decisions were being made around me, not with me. I was still here, still capable, but no longer consulted. That night I placed the binder back on the shelf without opening it. I turned off the light and lay awake, counting the sounds of the house. Pipes settling, wind against the siding, a distant dog barking, everything familiar, everything unchanged. And yet, beneath it all, there was the quiet certainty that something essential had been taken, slowly, carefully, while I was still standing right there. I didn't change my behavior right away. That choice came slowly, though it didn't feel like a choice at first. It felt more like holding still long enough for the water to clear. I kept answering calls. I kept letting my son handle what he said he was handling. I kept thanking him when he dropped off groceries or mentioned another task he'd taken off my plate. But I watched more closely. I began keeping a small notebook in the drawer beside the phone, the one I'd used for years for reminders. I didn't label it. I didn't dress it up. I wrote dates, company names, short notes, call received. Statement arrived. Auto draft noted. I wrote in pencil, lightly, so the pages didn't feel crowded. Mail was opened at the same time, each afternoon, seated at the dining table with the window cracked just enough to hear the street. I read everything once through, then again more slowly. I didn't react. I didn't mark anything up. I simply noticed what appeared, what repeated, what shifted, which services overlapped, which charges settled into a rhythm, which names appeared as contacts. I noticed how often my son used the word easier. Easier for me, easier for everyone, easier this way. I also noticed what he didn't say. He never said with you. It was always for you. I didn't comment, I just remembered. When he returned the binder after making updates, I thanked him and placed it on the shelf myself. I didn't open it while he was there. I waited until the house was quiet and the dishes were done. Then I took it down and compared its contents to my notes. I didn't rush. I read the fine print, even when my eyes tired. Especially then, I started making copies. Nothing elaborate, just the pages that mattered. I stacked them in a thin, unmarked folder and slid it beneath a pile of old magazines in the hall closet. It wasn't hidden so much as set aside, like something waiting its turn. There were moments when I nearly spoke up, when a new charge appeared or a letter arrived that assumed my continued consent. Each time I paused. I asked myself what would change if I reacted immediately. Would the facts disappear? Would the pattern stop? Or would everything simply move faster? Before I understood the full shape of it. So I waited. I let my son believe things were running smoothly. I let him explain processes and timelines as if they were settled matters. I nodded when he said systems were complicated now. I didn't argue when he said this was how people handled things these days. At night, I spread my notes across the bedspread and checked them against the copies I'd made. The pattern was clear now. How one authorization led to another, how small permissions created larger obligations, how silence had been taken as agreement. I paid attention to myself as well, to how it felt to move through the house knowing what I knew. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't panicked. I was steady. I recognized the feeling from earlier years, from times when waiting had mattered more than speaking. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not neighbors, not friends, not even myself, out loud. I kept my days ordinary. I watered the fern. I folded laundry. I answered the phone. I watched the mail slot. The notebook filled slowly, not with accusations or conclusions, but with facts. Clean, quiet facts. Enough of them that I no longer doubted my footing. Enough to know exactly where the lines had been crossed. When another envelope arrived with language that assumed my continued consent, I wasn't surprised. I placed it on the table, wrote the date in pencil, and added it to the stack. I chose a Tuesday morning. Nothing about it stood out, except that offices answered early and lines were shorter. I made tea, sat at the dining table, and laid everything out in front of me. The thin folder, the notebook, the binder stayed on the shelf. I started with the simplest step. I called the first company on my list and asked for the department that handled authorization questions. When they asked how they could help, I said I needed to review how an account in my name had been opened. I gave my information slowly and clearly. When they mentioned sending a verification code, I asked where it would be sent. They read an email address that wasn't mine. I asked them to change it to the one I provided. There was a pause, then typing, then confirmation. I requested copies of every authorization document connected to the account. Not summaries. Originals, digital records, IP logs. The representative explained the process. I wrote down the reference number. I did the same thing again and again. Different companies. The pattern didn't change. Each call stayed calm. Each request stayed precise. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't argue. I asked for records. I asked for timelines. I asked for the name listed as the authorized manager. By midday, my notebook had new entries. Confirmation numbers, case IDs, timestamps. At the bank, I waited my turn and sat across from a representative in a quiet office. I placed my statements on the desk and asked for a full review of linked accounts and automatic withdrawals. She pulled them up on her screen and scrolled. I asked her to freeze any changes not initiated by me, effective immediately. She processed the request without comment. I asked to reset all access credentials, new passwords, new verification methods, no third-party managers. She explained the steps. I followed them. When she printed the confirmation, I folded it once and placed it in my folder. That afternoon, I updated my contact information across every account. I removed my son's email address. I removed his phone number. I requested written confirmation for each change. I didn't rush. I took breaks between calls. I stood by the window and let my eyes rest. Then I continued. The next step required forms, statements of non-consent, identity affidavits. I filled them out carefully, my handwriting steady. Where the forms asked when I became aware of the issue, I listed dates. Where they asked who had acted on my behalf, I wrote his name. I didn't soften it. By the end of the week, responses began to arrive. Emails first, then letters. Some accounts were flagged for review. Some services were suspended pending verification. Charges were reversed, where authorization couldn't be validated. In other cases, additional documentation was requested. I provided it. On Friday, my son called. He asked why certain services weren't working. He said he'd received notifications. His voice moved from confusion to strain. I listened. When he finished, I told him I was reviewing my accounts and making changes. I said I would let him know if I needed help. He didn't argue. He didn't press. He said he hadn't realized things would be disrupted. I told him everything in my name needed to reflect my consent. The line went quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. The following week, letters arrived confirming closures, adjustments, and reversals. My credit report reflected corrections in progress. Notes were added. Flags lifted. It wasn't instant. It was procedural. But it was moving. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. My son stood on the porch with the binder in his hands. He looked tired. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside and let him in. He set the binder on the table and flipped through the pages quickly, as if hoping something might change if he looked hard enough. He said he was only trying to help. He said things had gotten complicated. He said he hadn't thought it would be a problem. I reached into the hall closet and brought out my thin folder. I placed it beside the binder and opened it. I didn't explain what was inside. He saw the copies, the dates, the confirmations. I told him I had corrected what was in my name. I told him future decisions would be made with me, not for me. I told him access had been removed. He closed the binder slowly. There was no shouting, no raised voices, just the sound of paper settling. When he left, the house felt quieter, not emptier, clearer. That evening, I filed the final confirmations and returned the notebook to the drawer. I made tea and sat at the table, the oak surface visible again. My name, my accounts, my choices, back where they belonged. After everything settled, the house returned to its familiar sounds. The heater clicked on in the mornings. The kettle warmed and whispered before it boiled. Mail slid through the slot and came to rest against the door, waiting. What had changed wasn't the routine. It was the way I stood inside it. I thought back to that first envelope, how it felt heavier than it should have, how it stopped me mid-step, my shoe still pressed to the door. At the time, I couldn't put words to what was wrong. I only felt the shift, the quiet warning that something ordinary had crossed into unsafe ground. Looking back now, I understand that moment more clearly. It wasn't panic. It was my sense of self refusing to be handled without being asked. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being overlooked rather than abandoned. When people still show up, still speak gently, still say they're helping, but no longer pause to ask, that kind of loneliness doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and teaches you to doubt your own footing. It convinces you that silence is cooperation and gratitude is expected. I lived there longer than I should have, not because I was fragile, but because I trusted love to behave with care. I don't carry anger with me now. Anger would keep me tied to the injury. What I carry instead is clarity. I know the difference between support and control. I know how easily care can turn into convenience when one person stops being seen as capable. I know how quickly a living person can be reduced to a signature if they step back too far. My son and I speak less now. When we do, the conversations are careful, not cold, just measured. Boundaries have a way of changing the shape of relationships. They quiet things down. But they also return honesty to the room. Most afternoons, I sit at the dining table, my hands resting on the oak surface. My papers are organized again in my own folder, written in my own hand. It isn't about pride. It's about presence, about knowing my name still belongs to me because I am here to stand behind it. I've learned that independence isn't taken all at once. It slips away through small permissions, a signature here, a silence there. And it isn't reclaimed through force or confrontation. It comes back through attention, through patience, through the willingness to look closely at what no longer feels right. The peace I have now isn't the kind that comes from everything being perfect. It's the kind that comes from being visible again, from knowing that my life, my choices, and my voice still have weight. And that, at this stage of life, is enough. If this story stayed with you, I invite you to sit with it for a moment before you move on. Where in your own life have decisions slowly shifted from with you to for you? And how did it feel when you noticed? If you're willing, share your thoughts in the comments. Many people carry these experiences quietly, believing they're the only ones. They're not. Thank you for listening with patience and respect, and for honoring stories that remind us dignity does not disappear with age.